Was working late on my Haftorah when I heard a knock on my bedroom door. I opened it up, and to my surprise, there was a werewolf standing there with glowing gold eyes. He says, "Tomorrow, my son, you will be a man."
Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to the Goblin Lore Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Rediman. You can find me on Twitter at Lorthos. That's Lore Thos. And I am joined, as always, by one of my lovely co-hosts, who will introduce himself in just a minute. But before we do that, I am going to ask our question of the day, which is, what is something that you are irrationally afraid of? So I'll go first, and I'll say right off the bat, it's clowns. I can't do clowns. I watched it when I was like 7. Stephen King's It with Tim Curry as Pennywise, the ghost clown thing. Can't do it. I hate him. Sorry out there to any of you comedic Americans out there, as I know that you prefer to be called.
Right. Well, on that note, now I have to follow that. I am Alex Newman, found on Twitter at Mel_Chronicler. And I'm going to go, with something else. I'm going to say scorpions.
Oh.
And I think a lot of people are a little but I realized, I'm not a big fan of spiders, but I realized I am more irrationally, more afraid of scorpions when a friend and I were having dinner the other day, and because the service was so good, we were done super early, and we're like, well, this kind of sucks. We wanted to hang out, and now dinner's done. So we were over in the West End over here in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and there's a pet shop over there. So we decided to go to Petco and just wander around. And that particular Petco has some, I can't remember what they call them, but untraditional pet section. And so we're looking at these things, and the tarantula was what was freaking my friend out. And I'm like, you know what? I could deal with that tarantula. I need to take 2 steps back because that's a scorpion right above it.
Oh no.
And just wander around this little cage, just this live scorpion is no, just no. So I learned that, I'm putting scorpions above spiders.
That's, yeah. We all have to, rank our arachnids at some point in our lives, and I think that you learned an important lesson that day.
Yeah.
Scorpions are pretty scary, I will admit.
Yeah, it's that stinger.
Now, see,
that freaks me out.
That's why it, though, was so awful for me, because Pennywise, spoilers, Pennywise becomes a clown spider thing too, so it's even worse. It's just a mix of the worst possible things. All terrible. Speaking of arachnids, so things with I think 8 eyes. I think they all have 8 legs and 8 eyes, right? That sounds right. I'm gonna go with that.
Yeah, sure.
We are obviously talking about something spooky today. This is our special Halloween spooky season episode. And as one of my favorite podcasters, Benito Cerino of the Apocrypals podcast says, it is time for spookums and haints. And I absolutely adore Halloween and all of the, ghostly, spiritly times.
For me, it's as UPS would say. I
what
recognize.
Can Brown do for you?
I recognize Halloween. I just don't observe it. I understand that for some people it's a big deal, and that is wonderful. For me, I don't care. My work, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Joe. This is just one of the cool things that they do at my office. On Halloween, different departments will just do stuff in their areas. My department's going to be an apple orchard this year. Last year we were a haunted petting zoo or something. But then people can bring their kids and their family to come and trick or treat at the company. And this is a tradition that goes way back to I actually worked for a much smaller company that was bought out by this big company. Well, it was more of a merger. When you take the CEO of the small company, make him the CEO of the big company, you call it a merger. But so this is a tradition that has carried for, all the way forward. And like I was doing this when I was a kid. And so now my sister has kids, and so every year she comes to work, and I get to go around the building with her and her kids and talk to my coworkers and people and see what areas did what, and what were the best places, and so it's a lot of fun to do. But
that is awesome.
Yeah. So that's another thing where, like, my previous department would do the haunted house, and then they'd raise money to buy bikes for Toys for Tots. And so lots of people are doing lots of things for Halloween. And so for me, Halloween has always been, yeah, you go take care of that and I'll just cover the workload. I'll stay back and make sure the jobs get done, because you are having fun and you're doing something cool that brings joy to people. Y'all go do that. It's not for me, but y'all take care of it. And so that's, I definitely recognize, but I don't observe Halloween.
That's fair. That's a very measured take of yours, and I appreciate it. I will say I am disappointed as a soon-to-be 29-year-old adult person that, it's not considered socially acceptable for me to trick-or-treat anymore. I'm a little bit serious with when I say that, and I may or may not have talked to Mrs. Lorthos about, for my 30th birthday, which will also be my golden birthday, to get people together and actually go adult trick-or-treating. I think that would be funny as all get out. But, so there is definitely a little less enthusiasm on my part for Halloween on the actual day than there could be. But I love spooky season because it is a good excuse to, like, read ghost stories and, like, watch movies like The Nightmare Before Christmas or Hocus Pocus, or, just some movies that, do kind of get a little bit into the supernatural and the dark. Specifically, like, I love that this is, we're getting up to Samhain, which is the old Wiccan sort of observation of the time when the barrier between the spirit world and our world is the thinnest, and that's why ghosts and ghouls come out at this time of year. I just love all of that sort of mythology behind it, I guess is what I'm saying. It's very fun for me in that regard. But we are here to talk about other spooky things, particularly something that I think is possibly one of the creepier things that's happening in real life. And that is the, not to sound conspiracy theoristy, but the advent, or the, I guess, sort of continuation of the development of a Big Brother state in the U.S. and the world in general, but specifically in the U.S. And we'll be talking about that as it relates to Memnarch and his Panopticon on Mirrodin.
So to segue from Halloween and talk about these topics, I'm just curious on your impression, Joe. Do you think it more likely to find a kid dressed as Memnarch for Halloween, or an Amazon Alexa? What do you think would be scarier, actually?
Oh, what would be more likely is the Alexa. What would be scarier is also the Alexa.
Okay, no, that's fair. I mean, I did once go to an anime convention where someone was, cosplaying as Flo which was awesome. Someone else was cosplaying as a can of Red Bull, which was mildly confusing.
Hey, conventions and Red Bull go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think Alexa's probably somewhere right in between Flo and Red Bull. A can of Red Bull, but anyway.
No, yeah, we will get into Alexa, that is for sure, and I've definitely seen cosplayers dressed as iPhones, which will also come up in this episode. That is also for sure.
Yep.
Well, let's start kind of with Memnarch. We talked about Memnarch in the past. I know when we did our Goblin profile episode on Slowbad, we sort of touched on Memnarch and how he relates to the plot of the Mirrodin cycle, and then eventually Scars of Mirrodin block as well. A little bit. He'd been dead by then, but he sort of set the stage for a lot of that to happen.
Yeah, and I think this will be a good time to kind of go back too, because we were talking about that from the point of view of sort of Glissa and Slowbad's story, but there's a lot of sort of details of what Memnarch was doing that I think are both relevant to this topic and also like nice to kind of go back to this story and build on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so Memnarch, originally, I guess his first appearance in the story was in Odyssey, where he showed up as this hyper powerful artifact called the Mirrodin. Essentially, he was like a satellite probe created by Karn, to scout out planes throughout the multiverse and sort of just like get a sense of what's going on. Because Karn, after the apocalypse and after he ascended, just decided to traipse around the multiverse and sort of figure out what's what. And so Memnarch as the Mirrodin, as you do when you're an all-powerful planeswalker.
Yeah, like every story with a planeswalker sparking, they're just like, I'm going to peace for some millennia. Right. See y'all, and then they're just gone.
We're just going to see what's what. We're just going to see what's going on over here. And Karn, being the smart artificer that he was, decided, I'll just, leave this thing on Dominaria so that I can keep tabs on it. Nothing will go wrong. Things went wrong. So we won't get into all that, but essentially the Mirrodin, hyper-powerful artifact, lots of stuff that it did to screw up Dominaria, essentially set the stage for the Great Mending and the Time Spiral block and all that stuff. Karn, at the end of the Onslaught block, recovered the Mirrodin, took it back to Mirrodin, and converted it to a living creature, a living golem, called Memnarch. And so Memnarch was this sort of leader. He was I guess the lieutenant essentially to Karn. He became the leader of the Ur-Golems on Mirrodin, when Mirrodin was just a flat, geometrically perfect plane.
And kind of a caretaker was kind of my understanding of his role. A little bit of a gardener, sort of curator, like caretaker of this place.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it was he was called the Warden of Galdrun. That was Karn's castle. Fantastic name. But yeah, it was the Ur-Golems and the Blink Moths, and that's it. And it was the Blink Moths actually that first sort of caught Memnarch's eye to think like, oh, there is something more possible on Mirrodin, then called Argentum. There's something possible that's more than just geometric perfection. Maybe we can bring real life here. And so with Karn out of the picture at that moment, he renamed Argentum Mirrodin after his own previous existence as the Mirrodin. And then using the Ur-Golems, he terraformed the whole plane. He created the environments that we now know as the Oxida Mountains or the Dark Slick Sea, the Mephedros swamps, the Tangle Forest, and the Razor Grass Plains. The Razorfield Plains? I don't remember exactly which one it is. But they created the entire environment of the world, and then once that had happened, Memnarch destroyed the other Ur-Golems, and then began to create soul traps, these devices that took beings from other planes, brought them to Mirrodin, and sort of trapped their essence there. Essentially an artifact-based version of old pre-revisionist, timey-wimey planeswalker summoning of creatures, where they literally pulled creatures from other planes. And so that kept happening for centuries. He kept stealing people from other planes. And eventually, there was so much going on. And Memnarch, as mentioned, had destroyed all the other Ur-Golems, all his other peers. And so he realized that stuff was going to get out of control without, some major intervention. And he tried to do that sort of solo for a while. It obviously is a huge burden. So what he did is he created this sort of base of operations in Mirrodin's core called the Panopticon. And using that and using a sort of a fluid that he gleaned from refining the Blink Moths, he created Blink Moth Serum, which expanded his consciousness to be able to tap into this sort of surveillance system he'd created with the Panopticon and kind of keep watch on everything throughout the plane of Mirrodin at any given time. So think of, extremely large room with wall-to-wall and floor-to-ceiling TV screens.
So that's a big part of kind of his, I don't want to say descent, but, and you start to add, and this is a whole other story with Mirrodin, but you start to add life, and then all this weird stuff is happening, and then this is one of those, like, bad ideas beget bad ideas beget bad ideas. I mean, and maybe not necessarily, but it's just one thing starts to the next, to the next, to the next, and now we're here. I mean, and I think that is maybe something you can compare to the real life analog when we get to that. Where it's one of those things that I have no idea where this expression comes from, but it's one of those where it's just built one brick at a time. Like it wasn't designed to be this way, but as you add this piece, then you need to add this piece, and pretty soon you need to smooth the whole thing out and start building another layer. And now this is what you have.
Right. His goal went from this, sort of small concept of, oh, well, what if we can bring life to this world, to, oh, well, now this is kind of a problem, so I've got to do this thing to solve it, to, oh, well, that created this new problem, so now I've got to do this to solve it. And it just, like you're saying, snowballed way out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's without even mentioning the spot of Phyrexian oil that started corrupting Mirrodin, that Karn had accidentally brought to the plane, that sort of festered as mycosynth and really infected the entire core of the plane. That's without mentioning the growing madness that Memnarch was developing as a result of using the mind-altering blink moth serum. I mean, like, all of this started unraveling.
Yeah, and his whole thing with the Ascension Web, which we talked about in the Slow Bet episode, where he was going to try to take a Planeswalker spark for himself, and there's all sorts of things going on. But kind of that central concept is, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened with the Panopticon during the second Mirrodin block with the rise of New Phyrexia, but that's a little bit less relevant to what we're talking about. But yeah, it's just this idea that then he had to, because of all of these things that had been done, he had to take it upon himself to build this web, to build this information center and take control of it. I mean, and like use blink moth serum to expand his consciousness, Muad'Din style to do this thing so that he could take care of everything.
Right. And so, the Panopticon directly connected to the eyes of these metal artifact creature minions, the Mir. So for those of you that thought the Mir, MYR, were just these cute little things that just happen to be wandering around Mirrodin, oh, no. They are watching everything you do in Mirrodin. And, the way that he would then sort of act on these, on the things that he witnessed and saw were, one of the ways at least, were the use of levelers, the large artifact creatures that raised Glissa's entire village to the ground as a child and slaughtered all of her people. And so he would use those to sort of, I guess, cull bits of the environment or bits of the population that were becoming problematic. And that's a very blue philosophy too, is, we're doing this to see what happens, sort of thing.
And to some degree, well, I suppose green is more of a natural process. If it was happening naturally, then you just let it happen. Sure. I'm sorry to interrupt here. I just realized I was trying to make a Dune reference, and that's Muad'Dib.
Yes.
Muad'Din is an actual real life thing. So just want to set that right. Muad'Dib.
Yes.
From Dune.
Paul Muad'Dib, yes. Controls the spice, I controls the universe.
That's the one.
Thank you, Dune Cat. We will link to Dune Cat in the show notes because that's what we do. We bring you relevant memes from like 15 years ago. So yeah, I mean, that's the central idea of Memnarch and his information web. And you did touch on briefly, Alex, in the Scars of Mirrodin block, Jin-Gataxias, the blue-aligned Phyrexian Praetor, has sort of hijacked it, and is sort of taking on a similar role as what Memnarch did, controlling the flow of information throughout the plane and sort of trying to keep his eyes on everything at all times and gain as much knowledge as possible. We do see a little bit of that in some of the cards that happened in that block, such as, was it Thirst for Knowledge? I think it's Thirst for Knowledge. That's
no.
original Mirrodin block. I apologize.
There's also literally Serum Visions.
Yeah, Serum Visions, which gives you information about your cards. And
it I mean, just looking at the art, it obviously wasn't him. Well, yes, from Fifth Dawn, but I think that was referencing. It was referencing the same Blink Moth serum.
Yep. In one of the later sets, it actually does show a rendering of Memnarch, which is cool.
Yeah. Was that the Modern Masters one?
Yeah, I think so. Yep, one of the master sets. Yep.
Yeah, and then you had stuff with the Blink Moth things. Like there was, I know, Blink Moth Powder.
Yep.
Is being a super like Johnny Jenny type player. Blink Moth Powder, which if it's in your opening hand, you can just get a free mulligan, but it's a Mad Rock. Like that's information-y
and sort of precognitive almost. Because it doesn't have to be your official starting hand, you get a peek at what a starting hand would look like.
Yeah, you get to like Minority Report it sort of thing.
Yeah. So that's essentially what the Panopticon is in Magic the Gathering, and I first learned about this when playing and reading Mirrodin as a kid back in, this would have been 5th grade for me, I think. And so, I thought like, oh, that's a really bizarre and kind of creepy idea that he's watching everything you do. And he's got this big plan to I don't know, have total control and steal ultimate power for himself eventually. And there's only one person in charge of all this too. That was all a really creepy idea to me. And so it really caught my eye, Alex, and this is something that I shared with both you and Hobbs in our cast DM. It caught my eye when I saw this Washington Post article that describes how more than 400 United States police departments have been quietly working with Amazon to access footage from local residents' Ring video doorbells. And so is this something you've seen on people's houses lately?
Not really, but I don't think I quite get the same view of houses that Mailman Joe does.
Yeah, that's true. So I would have to estimate that if I'm being conservative about it, it would maybe be 60% of the houses I deliver to, probably more, have these video doorbells. And you listening to this might have one where it's sort of a, instead of your traditional little box that's about the size and shape of your finger, and then it's got the little button, or like a circle, and it's just got the little button in the middle that you bing, and it's a doorbell. It is a almost kind of looks like the size of one of those remote control. When you had like remote control stereos, it's kind of the size of that remote, not your TV remote, but smaller. But it's got a button that's the doorbell, and then there's clearly a camera embedded in it as well. And so there's Amazon Ring. There is, there are all sorts of these out there now. There is Simply Safe has one. I don't even remember all of these. And there are all sorts of different varieties as well. Some include floodlights. Some include a home security kit on top of just the video doorbell. But the thing that really bugged me about this, I guess the two things that really bugged me about this are, one, when I deliver mail, I notice that many of these sort of around the camera or around the button slightly lights up anytime I walk up to the door and drop in the mail. And then as soon as I start walking away, it dims off. And so it's clearly motion activated, and like watching whoever or whatever comes up to the door, right? And then it's that element of police departments across the U.S. are getting access to this. And so this is where we get into this idea of the Panopticon, which is a real life concept. I dug into this after finding out this Business Insider or Washington Post article, and we'll link to a Business Insider post that sort of goes through it compiles a couple articles on this that are really insightful. But the Panopticon is a concept that goes way back to the 1600s, 1700s. And it started in prisons. It was the main idea.
Kind of the idea of this, it's often used as a social experiment. One of these, looking at what would happen with the ubiquitous mass surveillance and things. And but the concept is it's a prison with jailers in the middle, and the prisoners on the outside, arranged in a way where the jailers can see out from the middle, but the prisoners can't see in. And so the jailers can see from the middle, the grand total of everyone in the middle can see everyone on the outside at all times. But because the people on the outside can't see in, they have to assume that they're being watched at all times, even if the tower is actually empty, because they have no way to know. Mm-hmm. And said this goes back to, I think you're right with the 1700s. I know you mentioned this to me, that Foucault, philosopher, as we would say, a modern philosopher, because he's only a couple hundred years old, was this was a topic that he discussed.
Yeah, he wrote a really long essay called Discipline and Punish, where he talked about the Panopticon in one chapter of it, and so your description is dead on. The original idea is architecture where there's like a central observance place, and around it is a rotunda, a circular area, so that there's no chance for prisoners to hide or conceal what they're doing. For actually a really good nerd reference is Guardians of the Galaxy, when they get caught in space prison, and there's that central guard tower, and all of the cells are around the ring, around the outside, all the way up. But then Foucault talks about this, and I think it's really fascinating that Foucault doesn't actually condemn the idea. He explores it. He talks about how it is used to control the behavior of people, because, like you said, the prisoners can't see if anyone's actually watching them, and so they aren't able to then sort of modulate their behavior to know that. And so there's this sense of always being watched, and so their behavior is then conditioned in a certain way to assume that they're always being watched. And Foucault does say, like, sometimes that's a good thing. Like, then it brings out, in certain situations, it brings out the best in people. If they think they're being watched, then they won't do certain bad things. However, he puts that in contrast with the idea of personal liberty, where you should somewhat have a right to privacy. We might argue that in a prison setting that you lose some of that privilege, maybe, but there is still, in certainly in more personal life, private life, you do have some of that right. And so I think we really get into a ethical question here, a moral question, where it does kind of lend itself to, if we're going to boil it down to a very admittedly unnuanced idea of black and white, where it's great, social good versus individual liberty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this comes to a situation too, where I was talking about, building things one brick at a time. As you start to establish a system, you can end up with something that looks like this, and then if every step along the way seemed justified, but you don't like the end result, like, is there something that was wrong somewhere along the way, or and it creates a lot of these questions. And I do want to say, we haven't referenced slippery slope, but I want to mention that actually is a logical fallacy.
Yes.
The idea of that being this thing is okay, except that this will then encourage us to take another step and another step and another step, and that one is wrong, is actually is kind of what the slippery slope is saying. Usually the people who are referencing it don't actually think that thing is okay, but they're not talking about the thing, they're talking about something else. And basically whenever you're trying to reference something else when you're talking about topic A and you're trying to reference topic B, that you're pretty much, that's a logical fallacy at some point somewhere there, because you're not actually talking about the thing. But in this context, we're actually talking about decisions that are looking at, if you build these security systems, you talk about it in the context of a prison. If we're putting it into a prison because, this is supposed to be a place in society where people are put after committing crimes, do they lose some of this? But then what happens to them when they lose that? And then is this short-term good behavior creating a long-term benefit, or is this not? Is this creating more? Is this creating harm?
We do get in that question of whether or not it serves whether or not it serves the purpose, or whether, it's sort of the ends justify the means question of, okay, at what cost are we going to do this thing? Does it give us this short-term goal of having them be nice in prison, or are we then maybe socializing them and then therefore, socializing other people in other certain ways to act in, maybe we're repressing certain behaviors and then that gets problematic. Maybe it's just a moral infringement on social or on personal liberty and individuality. There's a lot of questions with that. And I do appreciate that Foucault doesn't take a stand on that, because I think there are some elements of this that are good. Let's start with what Ring and these video doorbells were originally created to do. They were just supposed to have it be, I a homeowner want to know who is coming up to my front door so that I can feel secure about that, even if I'm not at home. That is a perfectly reasonable desire. And as somebody who has recently bought a home, I understand that feeling. In the first week or so, I couldn't sleep at night because I have anxiety about I guess PTSD about a string of break-ins I had to deal with a long time ago, that have really kind of left me shook a bit. So I was having trouble sleeping at night, and I would hear a noise, and I would creep downstairs with my softball bat in my hand and just peek out the curtains, and it was nothing. It was a breeze. So something like that, I can understand that urge to want to feel like you have control over that realm, and to want to feel like you can always see it and go, okay, it is safe. My mind's at ease, right? That's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But then we get into this thing where we sort of get into this next step where the police department is now requesting access to these things. And okay, so the idea there is, we as the entity that is dedicated to preserving order and social stability and law and justice in your area, we want to know, say there's a high, or not a high speed chase, but say a child gets abducted on your street, for instance. Maybe one of these cameras captured an angle of the car's license plate, and now we can track that car, and now we can recover that child. That's the idea there, right? So again, perfectly reasonable. That's a very, white sort of, in terms of the magic color pie, that's a very white ideal of, we are going to collectively use the information we have available to, preserve the greater good.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, and where the discussion really becomes more difficult, nuanced, deep, problematic bills, fraught with things, all sorts of words, is in both circumstances, talking about what prison is supposed to be for and what the police force is supposed to be for. And you end up in circumstances where they are not serving those purposes.
Right.
There are either in specific communities are not being treated equally, or specific ideas and things are not being treated equally, and then that starts to become questions of loss of liberty, not just privacy but potentially liberty is and issues of discrimination, and these tools being used, these security tools that are supposed to make your home safer being used to do just the opposite.
Right. And so then you have that question of, okay, when are they watching on the camera? When, and I will say, so just to break down exactly what the Washington Post reported and other investigations have reported this, law enforcement agencies have partnered with Amazon to gain access to an online portal showing a map of Ring video doorbells in their neighborhood. The portal allows police to figure out which cameras in a certain area may have captured surveillance footage, for which authorities need to request permission from homeowners to access. So that gives the purpose, the original purpose of the idea. And I will say, okay, in a lot of these cases, the authorities need to request permission from each homeowner to access it. That's good, right? That gives that personal ability to refuse. And Ring has said that users have a choice when police request their footage, and it doesn't support programs where recipients are required to share surveillance footage in exchange for a free device. However, some police departments have offered residents discounts on Ring cameras or free Ring cameras, and encourage them to download the crime reporting app Neighbors on their phones. And in exchange for doing these things, they are required to give access to the security footage, and that is in the contracts, the fine print, the things that we all click through extremely quickly when we are, going through it. And I do the same thing. So this is where we get into this is where it goes from being, okay, the purpose is right, but now the means are becoming a little bit questionable, where yes, this can be used at whim in some cases, and who knows what in any given moment that'll be used for. Like you said, there have been plenty of incidents over the recent years and many years, but especially have finally come to light and gotten more publicity, where there have been, we'll benevolently say, questionable motives by authorities to discriminate or to target specific people. And this could, in theory, give more, more power, not more authority necessarily, but more literal power to that agency or that force to monitor everything. And that is troubling. That is very on the verge of George Orwell's 1984. We've even seen this too with like my phone just turned on and started talking to me. It is trying to be helpful. It thought it heard the key phrase of what I was asking, but it's listening, and that's not always the greatest thing. I'm sure you've had conversations where you've been mentioning like, I could really go for tamales right now. You open up Facebook or whatever, and all of a sudden you see an ad next to your timeline for tamale restaurant. You're like, no, that's really weirdly coincidental. Then you open up you open up Twitter and you get a suggested ad for coincidences. There is something, and they've discussed this, that iPhones especially do tend to have open microphones.
Yeah, and one of the things with the iPhones too, they have an internal battery, so you can't even remove the battery to turn off that open microphone that I have sitting next to my bed when I sleep, because it's also my alarm to wake me up for work.
Right. Well, and that's a great point too. That gets into a great point of how ubiquitous this technology is. Right. Your phone is your computer, is your alarm clock, is your communication device.
It's my watch because I don't like things on my wrist.
It's your map.
Yeah, and because it's in my pocket, I don't have room for a pocket watch anymore.
I mean, yeah, it's so ubiquitous that these things that could normally, I think, be reined in by just general behavioral patterns of like, okay, I'm not going to use, say somebody tapped into my landline phone. Well, okay, I don't use that. We don't have one actually, so you can't tap into it. So just by virtue of like, I don't use that much, and I don't use it while I'm out, or at least there's significantly less damage that can be done than with something that is with you all the time and serves like 10 to 20 different purposes in your life. Something else, similarly, the Alexa Google Home situation, where that do sound like conspiracy theorists right now. People and researchers and reporters have documented that the microphones do tend to be open and do tend to listen to what you're saying, and whole conversations sometimes find their way into Google storage, cloud storage facilities. Nobody really knows what they're used for or who sees them or hears them, but they're there.
Yeah. And that has a tangent, as both this massive corporation is holding on to that for no apparent purpose, and that has its own issues. But you also have things like net secure, web electronic security is only reliable most of the time. At some point, at any given time, someone's breaking into something. And so the more random information that's just recorded, and even if it's not being used, it's just there that someone could take it. And like, what happens if some hacker steals, millions of hours worth of Google Home conversation recordings?
Right.
What type of personal information can be mined from that?
Right.
And yeah,
we're not even saying, stuff nearly like, kidnapping or blackmail, dramatic stuff like that. It can be just mundane stuff like your partner is applying for a bank loan and needs your social security number for it. Well, you just gave it to her, and now Alexa has it.
Yeah, and even more subtle than that, just personal information about the things you like can be used to identify you to various things. I mean, and like, this is how, working in the financial industry, I get a lot of training about how social engineering works, where someone trying to steal someone's identity doesn't come right up and say, what's your social security number and when were you born? They'll get little pieces of information that can get them access to more information. There's a reason years and years ago when Netflix first started their streaming service, like, they were trying to optimize their technology for recommendations. And so they held 2 contests where they took user data of what they viewed, expunged everything personal. Literally the only thing that was there was user 1564333 has watched these shows and movies. I can't remember if there's rating information there or not, but that's all they would give these people. And they had to stop doing that when the second time they did it, somebody took that data, mapped it to Facebook, and were able to identify 40% of those Netflix users simply based on what they had watched on Netflix and what they said in their Facebook profiles that they liked, the movies and shows that they liked.
Wow.
And it's like, just that right there, they could take Netflix viewing data, identify it to specific people on Facebook. Now they have access to, some data here and there, and they can start to use this to triangulate into other things. And that's based generally how identity theft. I mean, there's also the, just go into a database and steal a bunch of social security numbers and bank accounts. Like, that happens too. But that is only a portion of it. That's
right. That is the easiest to grok, but it's definitely not the most common.
Yeah, there is a lot more, especially these days, a lot more information about people available everywhere. And if you can start to parse that, I mean, and we've got computers that are getting better and better at parsing data, you can start to build complete pictures of people and start to build into information that lets you steal identities. I mean, a lot of people's, secret, when they have to do, secret questions and things, a lot of that stuff comes out of people's personal lives, the things that they like, relatively mundane questions about, places where they've lived or things that they've done, activities that they enjoy, family members that they have. And all of those things are stuff people post about on Facebook every day.
Yep. Well, and that reminds me of those things that come across Twitter where you were just thinking of this too, weren't you?
Yep.
Yep. Where they're like, oh, tell me about your high school mascot, and it's like people will just respond to it and just be like, yeah, my high school mascot was this. And like, because we just want to participate, but there is like one of the most common, password reset questions in the book. Like, or, oh, what was your first pet and its name? Or what was the make and model of your first, like all this very obvious stuff. So that's even that. But then you have the very like blase. I mean, and we live in a hyper-capitalist society where everyone is trying to sell you something. Every company is trying to sell you something at any given moment. Ads are everywhere. But just like things, this is another documented thing is the GPS in smartphones tracks sort of the places that you go to very frequently, and those tend to be the ads that show up on your social media or in your emails or whatever. And that data does get farmed out to places, by Google or Apple or whatever, that they can say, oh, this is, this is the Joe goes to Target every single day, which I do because of work. But like, okay, well now we at Target know that. And so we are going to offer Joe these coupons, which will get his business here. And it's very blasé and boring, but it's a little bit nefarious,
Yeah, well, do you remember the early days of Amazon when Amazon had specific targeted ads to people based on what they had their purchase?
Yes.
And there was enough of a blowback that they had to change that.
Yes. And it all comes down to, and this is the thing too, is and this is I guess where it differs from Memnarch specifically, because Memnarch was doing all of his surveillance very consciously. There was one person who was watching everyone distinctly, and there's we are not claiming on this podcast that there is someone secretly, that there is a capital D capital S deep state watching you right now. One deep state guy. The Illuminati chair is not sitting there taking notes on you, faithful Podwalker, and what you're doing. But it is these algorithms in place, these things that are built into what our technology infused world is now, that sort of are just learning and growing out of control. And this is I think very reminiscent of, say the Phyrexian glistening oil, and how it started taking something that was originally a really good idea to help us live society more efficiently, and it's really corrupting it into something that's almost a parody of itself, to where there is a whole bunch of my personal information sitting on some Google server in Siberia for no reason, for and not necessarily for no reason, but just because it can, just for the sole reason that it can. It's these algorithms that are taking this stuff and changing, and they are influenced by people, but they're not, they're not conscious. They're not doing it nefariously necessarily, but then this information that has been harvested can be taken to do somewhat nefarious things with, and that's where it gets into the really scary part to me.
Yeah.
So, all that said, I mean, society's pretty cool.
I was gonna say, we're hoping you all feel scared, if not of ghosts and ghouls, of maybe cell phones and Alexas.
Right, and really, aren't those spirits in the machines? Are just our modern day ghosts and ghouls. We've progressed from wolves in the woods to
to iPhones and
aisles.
Handbags. Yeah.
So happy Halloween, everybody. Watch over your shoulder, because if you don't, someone else will be anyways.
Ooh.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or you can email any questions, comments, or concerns to goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to support your friendly neighborhood gobslugs, you can do so at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. Goblin Lore is hosted by Hobbs Q, who you can find on Twitter at HobbsQ. The show is written and co-hosted by Alex Newman, who can be found on Twitter at Mel_Chronicler. Engineering, editing, and production by Joe Redeman, who you can find on Twitter at Lorethos. That's Lore Thos. Rights to our opening and closing music are held by Wintergatan and Cobalt Music. Links to their website in our show notes. Logo by Stephen Raphael on Twitter at Stephen Raffle. Goblin Lore is sponsored by Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at hipstersofthecoast.com or at hipstersmtg on Twitter. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.